Sport has contributed to climate change, from sporting events that require intensive carbon-fueled infrastructure development to sporting organizations that rely on carbon-heavy footprint transportation. The sports sector contributes to significant emission levels. But not only can sport positively affect the climate crisis through sustainable operations, but can also bring larger change through its enormous influence in society. We now have our next session, Sport and the Climate Crisis, which is our keynote address for Symposium 2022 by Mr. David Goldblatt. Dr. Goldblatt is a British broadcaster, sociologist, and author. In 2015, he won the William Hill Sports Book of the Year Award for Games of Our Lives, The Meaning and Making of English Football. Dr. Goldblatt is the chairperson of Football for Future and is the leading voice on the relationship between football and climate change, authoring the report Playing Against the Clock, which was released in June 2020. The report provides the first provisional estimate of the impact of global sport on the climate and warns that the climate emergency will have far more severe consequences for several sports and suggests radical reforms for rapid decarbonization of the world sport. Please note that this message is pre-recorded.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Goldblatt. I'm a sports writer, academic, and journalist. Over the last couple of years, I've been working on the relationship between sport and climate change. And it is my great pleasure to be with you here today at the invitation of the Sports Law and Policy Centre at what I believe to be the first gathering to discuss sport and climate change in India. And that gives me particular pleasure to do that, because as with the wider climate crisis debate, there is no global solution that does not involve India. And hitherto, the debate on sport and climate has lacked an Indian input. So it is my fervent hope today that we begin a journey that India and its sports community will begin to engage on the issue of the climate crisis, and I suspect make a decisive, important contribution to it. I'm going to try and do four things with you today to introduce you to the debate on sport and climate. The first is to think about the ways in which sport is imperiled or threatened by the climate crisis. The second is to think about what is sport's contribution to the climate crisis, just how much carbon is being emitted by sport, and what, as a consequence, the responsibilities and possibilities of the sports world are. Third, I'm going to take a little look at where the sports world is today, what the major initiatives have been taken on sport and climate, and some of the examples of best practice that's out there. Finally, I'm going to think about some of the unresolved debates and big issues in the sport and climate space, the kinds of questions that we will need to address and to solve if we are to find a practical solution to the climate dilemma. So let me begin by talking about the threats that sport faces under the condition of the climate crisis. Well, the first thing is to say winter sports. Winter sports are in a lot of trouble. As ambient temperatures rise around the planet, snow seasons are getting shorter, the amount of snow is shrinking, the number of days in which winter sports can be played is declining, and the costs of dealing with it in terms of artificial snow are getting greater and greater. We know from recent research from the University of Waterloo in Canada that by 2080, which is not that far away, only one previous host of the Winter Olympics will be a guaranteed risk-free environment in terms of snowfall. Otherwise, every other single one will be either high risk or simply will not have any snow. Anyone who saw the Beijing 2022 Olympics and the strips of artificial snow on bare brown earth on the mountains north of Beijing will know that this, at best, is the future of winter sports. And of course, it's not just elite sport that is going to be challenged here. It is the gigantic tourist industry that has been built on grassroots and leisure skiing and snowboarding. From what I can see, very few major resorts anywhere in the world will be economically sustainable 30 years from now. Of course, heat has all sorts of impacts, and the most obvious is serious rising temperatures and serious heat waves will start having an important effect on athletes and, of course, on audiences. In 2014, at the Australian Tennis Open, where temperatures were hitting 41 degrees C during the tournament, over 1,000 members of the audience were treated medically for heat conditions. For athletes, it is considerably worse. The physiology of heat is complex, but broadly speaking, over 35 degrees centigrade, you start getting in trouble for anybody engaged in athletic activity. When you add the possibility of high humidity, which together with the temperature constitutes what we call the bowl temperature, then the damage and the threats to athlete health are very, very considerable. The inability of people to lose heat, to control their heat, will start leading to cramps, to a very considerable decline in athletic performance. We know from studies done that as the temperature rises, the capacity of referees in baseball to make decisions and the performance of footballers on the pitch sharply declines. And at the extreme end of heat damage, we're looking at heat stroke. And then we're looking actually at athletes' health seriously imperiled, possibly fatally. And we are beginning to see this in a number of cases around the world during sports events. Most importantly, from a practical term, this will also lead to a huge number of cancellations with an immense financial impact on the global sporting industry. Just recently, in the 2021 heat wave across America, both the Boston and the New York triathlons had to be reduced in length or actually cancelled. At the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, the marathon, originally planned to run through central Tokyo, had to be sent 1,000 kilometers north to Sapporo, where the temperatures are considerably lower. Two other effects of the climate crisis associated with increased heat are increased levels of drought and an increased number of wildfires. Both of these are already having considerable impacts on sport. In India, on 2 occasions, the IPL has had to either cancel or reschedule and move games because water levels have been so low that it has been illegal to water cricket pitches. This happened in Pune in 2018. In Beijing in 2022, the main problem and the reason that there was so little snow at those Winter Olympics is those mountains have experienced a 3-year drought. And if there's no rain, there's no snow. In Cape Town in 2018, India's test match against South Africa was almost cancelled because the situation in Cape Town and its drought was so bad. And beyond the test, of course, grassroots sport and lower level professional sport was actually entirely cancelled. Everywhere in the world that is dependent on grass pitches for sport is going to face considerable problems and considerable expense over the next 30, 40 years. Wildfires are another problem. Long periods of drought combined with very high temperatures make many woodlands a conflagration waiting to happen. And in Australia in 2020, in the early part of the year, there were wildfires so bad that smoke was drifting into Big Bash cricket events in Sydney and making play virtually impossible, as well as very dangerous to the health of the audience and the cricketers. Extreme weather, of course, comes in a lot of forms, and that is one of the main consequences of climate change. We are going to experience in many parts of the world more rain more often. We are going to experience more storms and storms of greater intensity. We are going to experience more hurricanes and typhoons, and again, of ever increasing strength. This is already impacting on the world of sport. In the Caribbean in 2017, in Dominica and Grenada, two of the major new cricket facilities in the West Indies were reduced to matchsticks by the hurricanes that hit those islands. In 2019, at the Rugby World Cup, the typhoon Hagibis coming in from the Pacific led to 3 games being cancelled in the Rugby World Cup tournament because it was just simply too dangerous and too rainy and too windy to play. And we had this too at the Tokyo 2020 Games, staged in 2021, where high winds and another typhoon forced rowing and sailing to reschedule events. In Europe, we've seen the kind of damage and the kind of chaos that storms can cause. So last year we saw Storm Eunice with winds so high that they took the roof of Den Haag's football stadium in The Hague in the Netherlands. And we are seeing increasingly the number of games due to rain or high winds in football and cricket in England, but across Western Europe, leading to further cancellations. One of the main consequences of more rain is going to be more flooding. And we have seen huge damage caused over the last 5 years by floods to sports facilities. If you look at what's been happening in England, for example, Carlisle United, a lower level football team, had its stadium completely inundated with water in 2015, from which it has financially yet to really recover. In late 2021, the floods that swept across Belgium, the Netherlands and West Germany, according to the German Olympic Committee, did 100 million euros of damage to grass sports facilities and destroyed the Koenigsee, which is the first artificial sliding track built in Europe. The Maracanã of bobsleigh absolutely reduced to matchsticks, almost certainly completely irreparable. Alongside that, beach sports are going to be challenged all around the world as flooding is combined with sea level rises induced by the climate crisis. So rugby culture in the Fiji, for example, where the beach serves as the main zone in which the game is nurtured and played, will no longer be able to host sport. According to research done in California, the 60% of surfing beaches in Southern California, the epicenter of world surfing culture, will have such shifts in currents and sea levels that we will no longer see the same level or quality of surfing. Golf is also imperiled. Golf particularly likes a seaside course, what we call in the UK a links course, and low-level golf courses combined with sea level rises and flooding are going to be a problem. The R&A, which is the original body that determines the rules of golf, has suggested that 1 in 3 previous hosts of the British Open golf tournament will be unable to do so by 2050 because they will have lost holes, tees, whole fairways to the encroachment of the sea and flooding. In a study that I did a couple of years back, I looked at the 92 professional football stadiums in England and asked where will they be in 2050 in terms of flooding and sea level rise. And extraordinarily, one quarter of the professional football stadiums in England will, by 2050, either be underwater or facing considerable annual flooding. Grimsby Town, for example, on the North Sea coast of England, might as well invest in water polo because their current stadium is, without massive mitigation effects, going to be underwater 30, 35 years from now. But it's not just coastal stadiums that are imperiled. In London, which is also susceptible to flooding, West Ham Stadium, Chelsea Stadium, Fulham Stadium are all threatened with annual flooding by 2050. This is true too in many parts of Western Europe, where Werder Bremen Stadium is under threat. Bordeaux Stadium on the Atlantic coast. And in the United States, we can see that the Mets, the Yankees, and most of the major sports facilities in Miami will be at risk of major flooding episodes by 2050. And beyond that, in the major coastal cities of the global south, where there are literally hundreds and hundreds of major sports facilities, we can expect huge damage from sea level rises and from flooding. So that's a pretty worrying selection, I would say, of consequences from the climate crisis for sport. And we are learning more every day about these dangers. So what kind of contribution is sport making to the problem of the climate crisis? And then what kind of levels of emissions? To be honest, we don't absolutely know, because nobody is really counting, and certainly not enough people are counting their emissions right now. But if we look at the size of the sports economy, it's around 0.6 to 0.8% of global GDP. On the one hand, sport is much less carbon intensive per unit of GDP than, say, something like concrete or steel manufacturing. On the other hand, it's certainly more intensive than many other activities, above all because of the amount of transport that sports generate. And I cannot emphasize that enough in this debate. The carbon footprints that we do have of major international tournaments, national tournaments, clubs, franchises, and leagues all show that the number one form of carbon emissions associated with the sports industry is spectator travel. Not athlete travel, which is often the focus due to the use of private jets by athletes. And while this is still a factor, it is absolutely spectator travel that is the issue. The Qatar 2022 World Cup, approximately 75 to 80% of its carbon emissions will be spectator travel. Most of the Olympic Games that have been held recently with any number of spectators there, because of course Beijing 2022 was without, 70% of emissions. If you look at football clubs in Britain, where access to public transport is quite good, it's still the case that between 50 and 60% of emissions are coming from spectator travel. The rest is energy, construction, lighting, food, overwhelmingly food and beverages and packaging. So given that, let's just say for the moment that sport is around the average in its carbon intensity. That's about 0.8% of global emissions. And while that may not seem a lot, that's the equivalent of a small nation state, something like kind of, a medium-sized nation state even, around the kind of contribution of Poland or Spain. And no one's saying to Poland or Spain, you've got to pass on the climate crisis. But even then, even were sport to completely clean up its act, to go carbon zero, even if the great realm of associated industries, which have a huge carbon emissions, like sportswear, for example, or broadcasting, all of which generate significant amounts of carbon and are essentially dependent on the sports industry. Even if all of this were to go to carbon zero, clearly the wider problem will not be solved. Sport can only make its contribution. But the real prize here is how the sport can be a catalyst in the wider debate on the climate, how sport can change the culture and the politics of this conversation. Of course, first and foremost, sport needs to put its own house in order. It cannot speak to the rest of the world until it's sorted its own carbon emissions out. But were it to do so, sport is almost uniquely placed in this world to change the debate. Why is that? First and foremost, nothing is as popular in this world, in popular culture, as sport. No phenomena gathers so many people with such emotional intensity and focus as sport. And the climate crisis requires a universalism. Every single person and every single institution on this planet needs to make its contribution to solving the climate crisis. Sport has the opportunity to speak to a demographic constituency like no other, and to reach places and people that no other phenomena can compete with. Second, bizarre as it is, and I wish the world listened to poets and climate scientists, but they don't. There's a desperate lack of trust in expertise. But in sport, we still believe and we still trust the leading athletes, the leading clubs, the leading franchises. There is a degree of goodwill in the world of sport that is not available to most commentators. Again, if we were able to mobilize that in the cause of the climate crisis, it could make a massive contribution. Above all, normalizing this debate, denying oxygen and space to climate deniers and skeptics, and making the idea of climate action in everyday life a complete norm, not an area to politically challenge, but an area to engage with. Thirdly, sport is a place where we still believe in collective action. We still believe that we can be more than the sum of our parts, that a team can raise its game under pressure. These are cultural jewels. We rarely believe these things about political action. In an individualized and increasingly neoliberal world, we no longer generally believe in the potency of collective action, but that is what we need in the climate crisis. Again, sport has these precious cultural resources that could be mobilized to create the kind of politics that a global climate movement needs. And finally, sport is still a place of hope. Sport's still a place, corny as it might seem, where we believe that the impossible can happen, where last-minute turnarounds, miraculous changes of fortune can still happen, where we still believe, even if there's just one over left to go in a cricket game, where there's just 1 minute left of extra time in a football match, we still believe that turning the situation around is possible. That is gold dust in the politics of the climate crisis. And almost nothing I know other than sport can deliver that to a mass public. Third, what is sport doing given that it has these extraordinary resources available to it and it is facing such considerable threats? If we'd had this conversation 10 years ago, I'd have been saying, well, almost nothing is happening. But I am delighted to say that in the last 3 or 4 years, an absolute outpouring of energy, ideas, policies and commitments has been made at the leading edge of global sport. At the global level, we now have the UN Sport for Climate Action framework, part of the COP process, to which the leading sports federations and many national federations around the world have signed up, committing themselves to halving carbon emissions by 2030, by going carbon zero in 2040, and to mobilize their stakeholders, their spectators, their athletes, their broadcasters, their sponsors in climate action and climate education. For the more ambitious, the UN Race to Zero program is also available who want to take it to the next stage. Amongst international sports federations, we now see, again, at the leading edge, some really great initiatives. So FIFA, World Athletics and World Sailing would be good examples of that. World Athletics, for example, were the first world sports federation to commit to 100% reduction of carbon emissions, 10% a year over a 10-year period, with a clear timetable action plan for doing so. Admittedly, World Athletics have not yet tackled the consequences of spectator travel, which sit outside their calculation of carbon emissions. But as an internal plan, it has much to recommend it. World Sailing, I would say, are really interesting innovators because they have tackled more seriously than anybody else the problem of equipment. Sport creates a lot of equipment, burns a lot of plastic, and World Sailing has introduced new criteria that ensure reuse, recycling and upcycling of all boats and all equipments used in global sailing competitions. FIFA has committed not merely to carbon zero for its own operations, but for offsetting the entire cost of spectator travel associated with its major events. We're seeing also national federations at the next level down and national professional leagues begin to engage and not only sign up to the UN Sport for Climate Action framework, but develop their own specific policies for specific sporting areas. Probably the most exciting in this field is the Bundesliga, the German Football League, which is not only signing up to these global programs, but has now introduced a process of licensing. Every year, every football club must go through not only a financial audit to make sure that it's not going to go bankrupt, but must go through an environmental audit. It must begin the process of the move to carbon zero. It needs to appoint a sustainability officer and a variety of other markers along that journey. And if those clubs don't commit to those things, they won't receive a playing license. This strikes me as an extraordinary way of accelerating and shifting the level of climate action in sport, and something that not only leagues should think about, but every single sporting federation should be thinking about. We're also seeing an explosion of NGOs in climate action in sport. So we have Football for Future here in England, the first sustainability NGO inside English football, campaigning for carbon zero and transformation across the board. We have cycling organisations. We have Sport for Future in Germany, which campaigns across all sports. And above all, we have athlete activists. And that is the real prize here. And if I may say, in India, the real prize will be when MS Dhoni and his like are the climate activists of the 21st century. And then, oh my, we are going to see some political transformation. There are a number of organizations around the world. They're mainly in English-speaking countries at the moment, like Front Runners in Australia or Champions for Earth in Britain, or eco-athletes in the United States, that are mobilizing, supporting, and nurturing athletes who desperately want to speak up on these issues. And this is vital to progress in this field. Finally, just a shout out to some of the broadcasters around the world, particularly here in Britain, where Sky, BT Sports and the BBC have all created their own carbon zero broadcasting programs, as well as investing in content on their channels, which highlight the climate crisis and give a voice to athlete activists. We need this in every country, everywhere in the world. So where are we with all of this? We have a head of steam. We have real change occurring at international, national, and local level. We have athletes, we have spectators, and we have administrators coming on board. We're seeing the first sponsors coming on board as well. But there remain a whole series of issues and problems that we have yet to solve. The first is voluntarism or regulation. The Bundesliga example is excellent. We know it's great to see people signing up for these things, but the UN Sport for Climate Action Framework still has only 320 members. And there are at least, 10, 15,000 international, national and local sporting federations, not to mention professional leagues and grassroots organizations that need to be members. We have to start insisting that if you want to participate in global sport at every level, you have to begin the journey of climate action and carbon emission reduction. Secondly, we have a debate about micro and macro change. Most of the policies that are being initiated are about micro nudge changes, particularly, say, around transport, encouraging people to walk and cycle to a stadium rather than take the car. What is clear from this, though, is that sport can't do everything by itself. If you're going to change, the transport system, sport can make a small contribution, but we need massive changes in the infrastructure and pricing systems of the carbon-intensive transport networks that we have created over the last century. Sport needs to be speaking up as an advocate, not for only change and micro change in its own domain, but at the very highest political level, and above all, on issues of transport. Thirdly, the Global South is not present in this conversation at the moment. I cannot tell you the frustration it brings to me to look down the UN Sport for Climate Action Framework and see German, Danish, Japanese, Australian, English and American institutions, but I am yet to see Indian institutions, Chinese institutions. I see no voice for Africa. I hear no word from Latin America. And there is no solution to anything in the climate crisis without the massive contribution and voice of the global South. Everybody needs to be engaged, everybody needs to sign up, and everybody in the global South needs to change the conversation. Because one of the most important things that we're going to need to think about in the next 30 years is how we manage some financial transfers from the richest parts of the global North and its sports industry to the poorest parts of the global South, where, as we know, most of the worst impacts will be felt in the next 30 years. Fourth, fossil fuel sponsorship. There is no solution to the climate crisis that involves the fossil fuel industry. At a bare minimum, if the global sports industry wants to speak up on this issue, it cannot take money from fossil fuel companies anymore, from the Gazproms, from Chevron, from the Azerbaijani National Oil Company, all of which have been giant sponsors around the world. We need to stop now. It's interesting that British Cycling's chief executive has just been forced to resign after negotiating an absurd 8-year deal with Shell to promote active transport. This is not working. This cannot carry on. We simply have to draw a line. Oil and gas companies need to be removed. As tobacco companies were removed from sport, so too the fossil fuel companies. Fifth, the issue of offsets is a big conversation. The way in which almost every global sporting institution is reaching its carbon zero targets is by dealing with a residual level of carbon emissions, usually around aviation and other forms of fossil fuel use, that are offset by investing in renewable energy or carbon sequestration or reforestation programs around the world. There are a lot of problems here, and we need to have a big conversation. This is true not just of sport, but of all global institutions that are dealing with these things. Many offset programs don't work. Many reforestation programs peter out after a couple of years because they're not sustained properly. Much renewable energy investment will be happening already, and we are not adding to the stock of renewable energy, just juggling around who's backing it. And above all, carbon sequestration from these things will take place in 30 years, and we need to reduce emissions now. So we need to have a big conversation inside global sport about how much offsetting is actually permissible, what kind of offsetting we do allow, and whether we should switch some of that offsetting from reforestation to, for example, transfers to reduce carbon emissions within the sports industry. For example, it would be interesting if Qatar, instead of investing in reforestation programs in Turkey around the 2022 World Cup, were to spend that money providing Africa, let's say, with LED floodlights for every stadium and grassroots pitch, which are currently totally unavailable. Finally, one big philosophical question for us all to think about. What do we do if at the end of an immense program of climate action, with the best will in the world, we still find we are irreducibly generating more carbon emissions than we can reasonably offset or deal with? Are we going to have to think about perhaps less sport? Are we going to have to think about less growth? Are we going to have to think about fewer commercial international spectacles? I love sport. I really love sport. That's why I'm here today. It brings me joy. It brings me pleasure. It's changed my life. But I have to ask myself here at this extraordinary moment in climate history, are we really going to be burning the last of our budget, sending pole vaulters around the world? There's a big question for us. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I know that this is one of the most important questions that we in the global sports movement are going to face. If we want there to be a future for global sport, we are going to have to ask some really difficult questions, and we are going to have to take some really serious action. But as a final point, let me remind you, if we do, the prize is immense. Global sport, with its extraordinary cultural reach, its extraordinary cultural power, its integral, relentless optimism about the possibilities of the world, could be one of the most important catalysts for tackling the climate crisis. I really hope that we around the world, and above all of you in India, can help make this happen.
We hope you all enjoyed Dr. Goldblatt's address as much as we did. We now have Mr. Goldblatt has expressed his desire to engage with you all. So if you have any questions or wish to speak to him, please reach out directly to him. His contact details are available on his website, davidstephengoldblatt.com. We now want to hear the audience's opinion on the impact global sport has on the climate, and to curate this audience discussion, I'd like to invite on stage Mr. Abhayraj Naik, co-founder of the Initiative for Climate Action and visiting faculty at the National School of India University, Bangalore, and the Azim Premji University with the School of Policy and Governance. Mr. Naik is actively associated with the Environment Support Group Bangalore and has also been associated with the Meiklejohn Civil Liberties Institute, Berkeley, USA. Other national and national advocacy, activism, and research groups for several years. He's co-authored the book Green Tapeism, a review for the EIA notification 2006, and has authored a number of other articles, reports, essays, published both in academic and non-academic media.
Good evening, and thanks for that lovely introduction. And what a beautiful set of comments from David Goldblatt there. So I'm going to do one thing and one thing only today, which is hold a conversation in an area which is full of questions and is desperately looking for creative and innovative answers, right? And before I get into some very, very brief reflections on what David said and invite you to bring your own experience, your aspirations, and your learning into the conversation, I want to do a quick dipstick survey. How many of us in this room have decided to call off a plan to go play a sport, maybe get a swim, play a game of cricket, go out for tennis, visit the local club or sporting center for snooker or table tennis, even step out for a game of volleyball on the beach? How many of you all have had that experience where you've decided to call it off because it was too hot or the rain was too heavy and you weren't sure how you'd get there and back? Could you just put your hands up for me, please? Okay, I think I see almost every hand up in the room. Those of you all who didn't raise your hand, maybe you want to think of a moment when you weren't playing, but your experience of enjoying a sport, perhaps on television, was interrupted, right? And I'm pretty sure 100% of us in the room have in that very embodied way experienced what climate change means to the future of sport, right? So I want to start off with joining David in expressing congratulations to the Sports Law and Policy Center, the visionaries and organizers behind this beautiful event, and each and every one of you in the room, because I really haven't been as excited as I am today about a possibility for climate action, right? And I've been working in the climate space for about 20 years. And it's only today, as I was preparing for my comments, listening to David's comments, doing some research into the connection between sports and climate change, that I reached this aha moment, where it became crystal clear to me that with the exception of perhaps religion and art, there is nothing in the world apart from sport that can provide us a climate future that we are worthy of as human beings at this stage of evolution on the planet, right? And so in that sense, this is a tremendous, tremendous opportunity. right? I want to congratulate the organizers and each one of us who are in the room today for being at the cutting edge of this conversation, right? It's not a conversation where anyone has the answer. Nobody really knows how exactly is sport going to respond to climate risk. What does that mean for broadcasting? What does that mean for fairness? What does that mean for safety? What does that mean for the future of cricket? What does that mean for new technological innovations, which I think a subsequent panel perhaps might go into, right? But that's the opportunity field. We're trying to figure it out, and I want to allow that comment to take me to my second comment, which is I think it is here in this country, India, and in the global south, that many of these innovations and answers will first be found. Right? For those of you all who might be a little wary of this climate change business, right? I want to put out two simple propositions so you understand what's at stake if you're thinking about sport in India in the climate context, right? Number one, India is the third largest emitter of carbon in the world right now, right? There's only China and the US ahead of us in overall volume terms. And the world will not let us forget that, right? So India will always be pointed at, oh, you're the third largest emitter. And India will say, oh no, but we've just started our journey. We have such a big population, so on and so forth. But keep that figure in mind. So as David expressed, without India, there's no climate solution, right? Second point, India is perhaps the most vulnerable country, right, in terms of the types of risks that we are to see. Heat waves, rising sea levels, floods in cities, so on and so forth, that one can imagine in the world, right? And cities like Mumbai, Kolkata are right on the top of the list, right? Cities that are sports crazy, lovers of sports, sites for great sporting spectacles are right on top of the list of climate vulnerability in the world, right? So this is where the rubber hits the road when it comes to climate change. It is in our cities, in our country, that we'll face the greatest impacts and we'll discover the greatest possibilities. Third, for those of you all who might, unlike me, be like, oh, David's comments a little academic, there's so much going on, climate change, ooh, my head is swooning with all these figures and facts. Don't be surprised, that's how most people react to climate change. Right? That's why the complexity of it is part of the problem. For those of you all who like the detail, I'll certainly encourage you to check out David's detailed report, right? As the introducer suggested, he's very, very open to a future conversation. And in some sense, just to put it back in telegraphic form, number one, shit's going to hit the ceiling. Climate change is going to make life difficult. It's going to get too hot. Stadiums are going to get flooded. Golf is no longer going to be possible. You're going to have impossibility of water that's required for sports. Athletes are no longer going to perform at the way they used to. Referees can't perform well. All that doom and gloom stuff, right? How climate change affects sport. Second, how sport itself is part of the problem of climate change, right? Sport, particularly the transport related with mega sporting events, has its own carbon emissions, perhaps an issue which is blown out of proportion sometimes. Third, how sport, like religion, like art, is this beautiful way of living with hope, with heroism, with exceptional endurance, with teamwork, with new possibilities that might be the only arena of escaping from our current climate predicament. And fourth and finally, there is a bunch of stuff going on in the world. It's there at the United Nations level with the framework on climate and sport. It's there at the highest levels of sports federations. Take the German Football Federation and its winning bid, right, for the next UEFA, which put environment and climate very prominently there. It's there in the winning bid for the next Winter Olympics, or the 2026 Winter Olympics, right, in Italy, which recognizes that environment and climate is a big issue. And that's an opportunity for India to also contribute to. So there's no need to think only of, how are we going to stop our carbon emissions? Or how are we going to deal with the difficulty of hot days in India where anyone who wins the toss in an IPL game will choose to bat first, right? To allow for the hot afternoon to dissipate. There's a whole host of possibility. And depending on who you might be, an academic, a researcher, a sportsman, sportswoman, sports player, right? A broadcaster, a nonprofit working in the space, there's a whole set of opportunities to invoke, right? And that opportunity space really bringing out resilient innovations from India, suggesting to the world how sport can continue in a way that's sustainable, might really be our biggest contribution. So I want to end my little monologue by once again bringing my favorite thing in the world. I'm an activist lawyer, right, which is justice and climate justice into the frame. Remember that when things go bad with the weather, those who are already impoverished, those who are already struggling with zero resources, with a bamboo pole vaulting pole to somehow make it, are going to find it even more difficult to train, are going to find it even more difficult to access the necessary conditions to allow them to break through, right? And so climate change really has a justice element to it. It affects those who are already in some ways at a disadvantage even more strongly, right? And in the Indian context, that means it affects the real heart of our sporting talent in rural India without facilities. It affects women sportsmen. It affects elderly who are interested in sport. It affects children who are exploring sport, right? So keep that in mind. That's something that is of concern, but that is also an innovation space for opportunity. Okay, so that's my set of comments. Now, I would love to, in some sense, invite comments and questions. David is not here. And like you, I am a learner in the climate and sports space, so I can't provide beautiful, pearly answers like some of our earlier panelists did. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and see connections or underline emphasis that come out in your questions or comments. And really, if at all you have any hesitation of not being an expert in this space, let me reassure you, there is no expert in this space. Maybe the man on the screen is one of the handful of experts who have plumbed the depths of climate and sport and the intersection thereof. So whatever you'd like to bring into the conversation is welcome. This recording will also go back to David, and hopefully we'll have an emergent conversation that comes through from it. So maybe I could see hands, and we could have maybe 2 or 3 comments, and then we could take the next set. So I see a hand right up there, and I'll request you to please introduce yourself again so that everyone knows who you are, and then you can launch into your comment or question. Yes, over to you. Yes, we can hear the who very clearly. Go for it.
Sorry, this is Sanjana again. And
Hi.
Thank you so much for that. And by the way, you're no second to Dave, You're no second to Dave, so I don't want you to feel like, you're not capable of taking questions. I don't have a question, but I have, first of all, I need to share my guilt as I heard Dave speak so much about carbon footprint. Owing to the nature of my work, I travel a lot, literally like 300 days out of 365 days in a year, all with the focus to help athletes across the world. But then again, I'm adding to that. Somehow COVID allowed my carbon footprint to be a little less, but it's back to what it used to be. So I'll do my best to see how best I can contribute less to the problem, correct? Now, second, I wanted to understand your thoughts on, as much as a carbon footprint is not so great for the climate, I want to believe that the lint that comes out of clothing, because most sportswear are dry fits, and not all of them are of a good quality, because good quality is more expensive. And especially in sports ecosystems like India, where largely we have a lot of money, but funds are less to the people who actually do sports, correct? So we resort to using sporting material with our, jerseys, etc., that is low grade, which does produce a lot of lint, and we don't have enough to change, so we have to wash it and use detergents, etc., etc. So that also contributes to a lot of impact on soil and water and air, you see, and that can kind of impact the biosphere. The other part would be, as much as we talk about, not just the audience experience in a stadium, we're talking about first screen and second screen, and soon there'll be a third and fourth and fifth, which means our internet has to become more stronger. We're talking about 5G, soon we could be talking about a 10G. So what happens, to the electromagnetic radiation that comes out of it? It might not be ionic, so to say. It might not be at a level that's dangerous immediately, but over a period of time, it is going to accumulate. And just one simple...
I'll request you to also quickly close out so we'll get a bunch of voices. Yeah.
So for example, if the bees are affected, that impacts our ecosystem too, and that impacts climate change as well. So what are your thoughts about these aspects to sports contributing to the problem?
Thanks, Sanjana. So I'm, as I said, going to park the response, and I've noted down all of your very useful points, and thank you very much for getting started the dialogue here. And folks who have heard some of those comments, let's try and do some collective stitching here. So feel free to respond to each other, disagree with each other, so on and so forth. I'll try and pick up some questions myself. So I see 2 hands, and we'll have both of those inputs, maybe one after the other. Please do introduce yourself. And sorry, last word, housekeeping. Try and keep them slightly brief so that we can have more voices. The organizers are looking at their watches again and again, so. No, I can't hear you. Is there another mic around? Maybe I could pass one of these on from the table?
Hello?
Yes, now it's good.
Yeah, so I'm Dilip. David said that, sport needs to move away from fossil fuel sponsorships. But in India, Indian Oil and ONGC are, they are not only sponsors, but also they employ a lot of Indian athletes. So how does that work? Because for a lot of these Indian athletes who are coming from impoverished backgrounds, getting into sport and all, it provides jobs and a PSU stable income for life. So how do you deal with that? Back with me.
Thank you. Beautiful question, Dilip.
Yeah, I'm Rajesh. I'm both a sports enthusiast and an environmentalist. So I want to take off from where Dr. Goldblatt left about thinking about less sport, right? Now, is that even a possibility for India at this point of time? So in order to actually start thinking on those lines, I mean, we might be able to get Dhoni to comment on it, but to actually shake the system, to take notice, what is the kind of evidence that we need to bring to the table for discussions on minimizing the footprint of sport, right? So I think it has to be, something on the lines of, a GHG footprint of the IPL, for instance. And as a follow-up to that, after building the evidence, where do we introduce this in a policy conversation? Which is the agency which is going to be even sympathetic to have a conversation on this? So these are challenges that I'm seeing, and perhaps some reflections on that will be useful.
Fabulous. Thanks, folks. So let me just, in some sense, jump to what I found personally as a very provocative and very, very relevant point, which is no fossil fuels in sport. Are you serious? Have you actually looked at who's sponsoring sport right now, right? And I love the fact that David had the courage, conviction, and the audacity of imagination to say that. Because from a climate perspective, there is no doubt that fossil fuels need to stay in the ground, right? But then this comment, does that hold true equally for all countries? And should India also be like jumping into this bandwagon of, oh, we are guilty? Should Sanjana be feeling bad about, oh, I'm traveling so much to help sports people? And there, my nuance would be perhaps not, right? I don't think the same story of transition applies for a Germany and India. I don't think the same criteria of what your carbon footprint might be apply, and I say this to an Indian citizen and to an American citizen, right? And especially for those who in some sense have cascading effects, it's a good idea to travel more so that your work can perhaps influence a lot more lives, right? And I'm willing to debate on this because people might have different views. If there's a hardcore climate activist in the room, they'll be like, sell out, right? But I do think India has a slightly different position in the climate discussion, right? And I don't think shutting down our coal fields, letting go of any chance we have of development right now is the answer. But I can't close my ears to the science either, right? The future of fossil fuels is over, right? If we have to live in a habitable world, there's no doubt around that. And I think I would be delighted to see an Indian sportsperson become a climate champion, right? I haven't seen enough of those. I've seen perhaps a luge athlete. I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing the name of the sport right? Mr. Keshwan, who was on the program or is part of this network, broadly speaking, right? And I've seen maybe Rajasthan Royals and Schneider Electric get into a wheel offset. I've seen the Chinnaswamy Stadium in Bangalore tie up with a local NGO, Hasiru Dala, saying our cricket games are going to be zero waste. But I haven't seen the kind of champions for climate from the sporting fraternity that I see from other countries, right? And that would be really something extraordinary to evidence in India. And I think each one of us has a role there. Some of us might be that champion. Some of us might be representing that champion. Some of us might be indicating where there are the support structures for such people to express their voice, right? As we saw from David's comments, there is a full ecosystem, right? Supported by no one less than the United Nations framework, supported by some of the most successful economic entities in the sporting world. So the argument of, this is not going to make money and money is what rules the world actually doesn't cut through, right? Because very rich clubs and rich sporting federations are embracing climate talk as early leaders. Finally, on the question of, I think there are two questions which I could just briefly allude to. I don't have the answers. I think sporting clothing that is suitable for Indian conditions and responds to the climate context, right? Coming back to the apparel point, I think that's an innovation opportunity, right? I don't think that's something that an Indian entrepreneur or a global South entrepreneur should miss on, right? And I mean, I'm quite a bit of a fan of Adivasi cosmologies and knowledge from indigenous communities. I know of many, many ways in which Indian communities deal with adverse weather, right? And what does it take to convert those crude sporting clothing examples into marketable products, right? That's a great stream of innovation. And that's why there are climate tech entrepreneurs from usually white, usually from rich Western countries, traveling around in Bangalore, in Delhi, or in Bombay these days, right? They want that information. So I certainly think we have the answer. And I think that is also the answer to your question. How does one introduce this into the policy conversation? You introduce it into the policy conversation not by saying gloom and doom. We are all going to die, no more sport for us, what do we do, right? Because then most people will shut down. They'll say like, boss, I have enough going on in my world. Don't tell me about this gloom and doom story. I can't deal with it. You have my sympathies. But if you tell them, hey, the future itself is changing in a way that we can't be sure whether we live on this planet anymore, right? That's when the climate scientists say that 2030, which is just 8 years away, is when we're really going to see it. And to be honest, we're seeing it today. We're seeing it today in cities. We're seeing it in Qatar. We saw it in Japan. We saw it in the Australian Open, right? We saw it in marathons that are being cancelled, Ironman triathlons that no longer can be there, golf which no longer is viable, even climate deniers like Trump taking measures to protect their golf fields from rising sea level. So it's already here. And to respond to it is going to require, like all emergencies in human history, incredible innovation. And with that innovation comes incredible economic opportunity. And policy loves economic opportunity. So with respect, I heard several commentators earlier say that, it's been commodified, market is all over, but that has an opportunity space as well, which is worth exploring. So that's my attempt at a response. Sorry, I went on for too long. Maybe one more set of comments or questions. And even if you have answers to other questions that I didn't have answers to, those are very welcome. Could I just see hands so I can put a queue system? Yes, sir. I think there's a hand here. If you could pass on a mic as well. Anyone else who'd like to jump in? If you want to just hold your space in the queue, you can catch my eye or her eye, that would be good. Yes, please.
Yeah, hello. My name is Tushar Katheria. So I getting the point to the talk about the how PSUs, oil companies like Indian Oil, Bharat Petroleum, Indian Gas, how they recruitment, because I know how the process is. So these organizations, they really want to promote the sporting activity, and that's why they employ the sporting personalities like Ajinkya Rahane, Zahir Khan, and recently they recruited R. Pragananda, who is a prodigy, young prodigy, grandmaster right now in the chess. So that's why they want to promote the sports, and that's why they recruit such kind of talent, so that not only they get this some kind of a monetary compensation while they're playing their games, but also they want to make the mark in the global events. And that's why there's the main objective of it, like the oil gas companies like these PSU which are doing right now. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Please remind me of your name again.
Tushar Katheria.
Tushar. Thanks, Tushar. Yes, I think final few minutes more. Yes, Manaswini, I at least know one or two people's names in the audience.
So I was just thinking, like instead of looking at sports from the professional sports angle, when we look at sports from general fitness angle, there's a lot more opportunity for environmental, pro climate change policy. So when I was earlier working on a project for lakes, we found that a lot of people wanted jogging paths, and a lot of people wanted fitness equipment and spaces to run and spend time, leisure activities. So like creating greener spaces would actually help, which would actually go hand in hand with sports for general fitness, and also cleaner air levels to help people do their leisure activities and stuff. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Great comment there. Maybe one final comment or question or even a disagreement. Yes, there's a hand here. Who's the timekeeper in the room, by the way? Let me know when. Okay, thanks.
Hi, my name is Gopal. I actually have a sort of a question. Because Abhijit sir is here, it's sort of a unique opportunity, because we heard him and his wonderful Brahmaputra Volleyball League, and we all know every year in the news Brahmaputra is when the area is flooded, right? So has that already started affecting the way you conduct the league, the way you schedule it, and do you foresee this getting affected? If you can just share your thoughts about this.
Thank you. Someone has taken up the invitation to engage in dialogue. Yes, please. If you don't mind, not to put you on the spot, but if you're willing to share, we would love, I personally would love to hear the answer to that. I just had a chance to come back from the Brahmaputra area.
Though I don't understand much, but one new things which we have started from season 2 is, instead of felicitating our guests with a gamucha or a shawl, we plant a tree in his name in the village. And that is our initiative which we have started. And it started from last year. And to supplement or complement this, as you know, Assam is a flood-prone area. So our practice season already get curtails down during the monsoon season. Then again, during the non-monsoon season, it's the sun sets at 4:30. Children come to the ground at 3:30. Just 1 hour window to it. But then again, I was just happy mentioning that Philips, they have renamed themselves as Spotify. They have under their CSR initiative, Khel Jyoti, they're lighting up our grounds, around 20 grounds. But then again, it will have an inverted effect on the climate. That's what I was feeling guilty. But nevertheless, I just want to ask, like, can we compensate this by planting more number of trees in our area? And a lot of our grounds are in the low-lying area, and we have rarely highland area somewhere in most of the places. And just to stay away from the guilt, if we keep on planting trees or something good initiative which can compensate it, so you can guide us better, sir.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, again, with caveats about being a learner like you, I think, at least if you ask me for my personal opinion, I don't think sports should carry guilt for climate change. Right? I think sports is one of the few beautiful things in the world. Sometimes I might get angry and say, oh, people have no electricity in India, and then this IPL stadium lights are burning late into the night. But that's not the problem of the IPL. That's the problem of the state here, which doesn't allow for, in some sense, equality or electricity access, right? So even with the calculations, and I think David gave us some indications, it's not like sport is contributing tremendously. There are other sectors, like just take the aviation sector, which by itself is, astronomically contributing to the climate crisis. So I really see sport as a pathway to a sustainable future. And I think that's what the Olympic Charter also recognized. Sports, culture, and environment, right? The three pillars, and environment was added. So yeah, I mean, this is not an excuse to stop being a little careful and to reuse and recycle and to see whether you really need to travel or to switch off the fans, etc. We should do all those things. Those things matter. But I don't think we should, at least as the sporting fraternity or a sporting network or a sporting community, I don't think there's guilt to be carried in that sense, because there are many really bad people out there who can properly be pointed at for the problem. And yes, I think trees are great solutions. I mean, it's not simple that a tree is always a solution, but right, in some sense, the tree is nature's original carbon sequestration device, right? If for those of you all who follow climate change, when Elon Musk offered some many $1 million reward for the best carbon capture technology, the internet went crazy with responses about, oh, it's already been invented, and pictures of trees were floating around. So I think trees and that gesture, right? Instead of a scarf, a tree, that is solid. I think that's beautiful. And we should memorialize those kinds of gestures. So thanks for sharing that.
Also, we use the public transport for traveling from one place to another. That is another.
Oh, yeah. That's, and I think there's a club in England and one more in Germany that are really getting plaudits for doing these things. So you should, in some sense, advertise more that you all are doing all these things and inspire others to do these things as well. Because I think many people just don't realize that, oh, it can be done, it can be simple, so on and so forth. So thank you very much for that. And yes, I'm at the end of my comments as well. I think I want to recognize Tushar's point. It's complicated. Let's not call anyone good or bad so simply, right? There's a particular role that fossil fuel companies and public sector entities have played in promoting sport in India. And one must acknowledge that value, while not necessarily diluting the science. And I think Manaswini's point is great, which is by public activity, we can actually take away carbon, right? So what does it mean if we start reimagining sport and public activity as active movement, right? What new industries get generated? What does that do to the overall carbon calculation? And for the nerds in the room, there's a beautiful review paper by a group of French scientists published last year, which has gone exactly into that question, right? How do we think of physical activity as the solution to climate change, but physical activity not in terms of taking a jet and going and watching Formula One somewhere else. Formula One is actually a front mover with the sailing industry. They've said they're going to be carbon positive by 2030, right? But by actually walking, by having gyms in public spaces, by using our parks for exercise culture, there's a lot that could happen there. So thanks once again. It's the start of a conversation. Remember, David is keen to hear from you as well and very, very contactable. And please do find your colleagues, your comrades, your conversationalists in the room to take forward this conversation. Thank you once again for your attention.